Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 43 of the podcast. Now I'm going to talk about my new book. I'm extremely happy to announce that just today it was published, and it's about boxing for self-defense, obviously, but I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about what it's about, who's it for, and so on. And before we get to that, a quick shout out to one of my patrons, Steve Holly. Steve, thank you for your support. Again, I always say this, but it's true. It's thanks to you, Steve, and everybody else that I can do all this stuff here, the podcast and everything else. So I want to, express my gratitude for your support. I hope you're enjoying the Patreon experience. We've got a lot of stuff there, a lot more to come. So enjoy that. And again, thank you for helping me out here with your support. And the same goes double for all my patrons, basically, Steve included, obviously, for the way that you guys supported me throughout the launch of my book. I'll explain a little bit, but a lot of things went wrong. And I explained to my patrons some of the things that I was facing, some really difficult hurdles that I had to overcome. And it's thanks to their support that the book actually did quite well, better than I expected, given all the problems. So thank you, Steve, but also all the other patrons. I appreciate you guys a lot. So that said, what's this episode about? Well, my new book, Boxing for Self-Defense, is out. And before I explain everything, the easiest way for you guys to get it is if you go to my main site, and that's wimdemeere.com/boxing. So not wimsblog.com, that's my blog. Go to wimdemeere.com, so my name, wimdemeere.com/boxing. And that's going to take you to the resources page. Now, I've been doing those kinds of pages for the last few books, and that's pretty much trying to find a way that I can add value to what's in the book in a way that I can't really do with a book. For instance, giving you guys links to videos. Now, sometimes you know how this works on YouTube is that the video disappears after a while, but it's somebody else uploads it, or you can find it at a different video site. Well, on a resources page, I can just, update the link and we're good to go again. And also, as time goes on and maybe another video pops up that I think illustrates something that I wrote in one of my books very well, then I can just add that. So the resources pages are pretty much something that I like to include, because it's kind of like a living document in the sense that it's always changing a little bit over time, and I can always add things and change them. Or when something radically new pops up, it happens every now and then I can add it. So go to wimdemeere.com/boxing, and there you find the resources page. And that's going to give you all the links to where you can buy the book. So the paperback just came out today. It's published. However, Kindle Direct Publishing, so KDP, that's the publisher, which is basically Amazon. They told me that obviously in the US it's available as of right now, but all the other Amazon stores throughout the world, it takes a few days for them to catch up, and the system just has to start from the US and go all the way through to the other stores. So it might take a few days, but you should be able to see the paperback version already. The ebook version has been online for a few days now, so that should be okay. You should be able to get that. But again, if you don't see the paperback right away, or if it says unavailable right now, give it a few days. So it's just Amazon systems taking a bit of time to sort all the logistics stuff out. So, how did I come about writing this book? Well, we have to use a Wayback Machine, and I have to talk about a blog post that I did, and I can't remember why I wrote it, but that was in 2013. So that's 7 years ago, almost 7 years ago. Sorry, and it was titled "Boxing for Self-Defense, Is it Effective?" And I'll put a link in the show notes so you guys can check that out. Now, here's the thing: I just wrote that blog post as that was probably something that was on my mind, but I didn't really think on anything other than that. Now, the really funny part is that this was the blog post that for years on end was one of the ones that got the most traffic to my blog, and just systematically kept being number one and number two of all the articles that I've ever written. People kept coming back at it. And for a long time, I was ranked number one in Google for when you search for boxing for self-defense. Obviously, that changes over time. I haven't checked in a while, but I don't think I'm ranked all that high anymore. So that kept on driving traffic. So there was clearly an interest in this topic. And that got me thinking. Now, there was a bunch of stuff going on. My health, I've talked about that, my surgery 5 years ago. So a lot of stuff got in the way of actually doing some decent writing. And at the time, I was still writing the leg kick book. So that was going to be my next project. So a few years ago, I actually then started writing on it. And everything was going relatively well. But one of the key things that I discovered very quickly as I started writing is that I was just putting way too much stuff in there, which is one of my main problems when I write. I write too much. I write encyclopedias, but nobody buys them. And that's always something that's difficult to judge before you publish, because some people want encyclopedias, other people hate them. So what is a good middle ground? Well, it's hard to say. Now, given that I've been writing almost 20 years now, I think I've gotten a little bit better at finding a good compromise. But still, this was such a huge topic that after many months of writing, I discovered, the structure that I have in mind for this book doesn't work. It's just not working. So I have to totally restructure it. And I started tinkering with it, and that's like laying this gigantic puzzle, and it still didn't work until there was light at the end of the tunnel, and that was the decision of cutting it in two. So I was going to do 2 volumes. So then I started writing some more with that in mind, and rearranging the chapters and putting one chapter that I'd already written in the second volume and so on. And after a while I realized, well, this doesn't work either, because I have to leave stuff out, or I have to put stuff in that doesn't feel like it fits in here, because it's a different aspect of the topic that just doesn't really fit. But it's important. And I struggled with that for a long, long time still. And eventually, and that was a final decision, and that's when everything started getting better, is when I decided to make it a 3-volume series. So what does that mean? Well, the first book, Boxing for Self-Defense, that is out right now, is pretty much getting you started. This is like the fundamental basic techniques, concepts, drills, and so on that you need to practice before you can actually start thinking about using boxing for self-defense. At the very least, obviously, my interpretation, my view on this topic. People will have differing opinions. That's perfectly fine. I can only write about what I think and what my experience is. So that's what you get. So the first book is just getting you started. It's pretty basic. Now I'll talk a little bit more about why that's important in a little bit, but I try to stay away from some of the more fancy or difficult techniques and just give you just a really solid foundation that you need to apply the sweet science in the street. What will the second book be about? Well, that's going to be about all the fouls and the illegal techniques that there are in boxing. So all the things you're not allowed to do, all the things that nasty boxers do and try to get away with in the ring, and so much more. But all that stuff is going to be in the second volume. And then the third volume will focus on how the street is different from the ring, especially when it comes to context. So, for instance, the environment. You're not in the ring. There's not canvas on the floor. There's weapons involved. There might be multiple opponents and so on. So a whole bunch of other things that are pretty much not relevant when it comes to fighting in the ring and using boxing as a sport. So that's quite a bit of information. That's quite a lot. So as you can see, at first I had everything jumbled all together in one book, and that just didn't work. There was lots of restarts for me that I had to start writing from scratch while I was trying to figure out how I would structure this. And it's like I said, it was like this huge puzzle that I was trying to lay, and I couldn't even see all the pieces correctly. I had a vague idea of the shape of some. I saw others very clearly. There was a lot of middle ground between those two. And then eventually I just figured it out, like, right, it needs to be 3 volumes. And now I can start actually laying that puzzle. So, but we're talking months and months and months, and actually over a year of this happening before I kind of figured it out. And what can I say? I used to be blonde, so my IQ is debatable. Let's call it that way. And for those who don't know, haven't met me yet, I used to be very, very blonde, and the gray in my hair is kind of masking it. So that's a joke, guys. That's a joke. Anyway, moving on. Everything was going more or less correctly when I had my shoulder injury. So I ripped off one of my rotator cuffs, and I had a huge tear in the labrum. So that meant that all of a sudden my arm was constantly hurting, so typing became difficult. And it took several months before I could schedule the surgery. So that was interesting, that surgery, let's put it that way. If you've gone through shoulder surgery, you know what I'm talking about. And then obviously the first month I couldn't type. I could hardly type. It was, you don't want to know. Anyway, so the first month was difficult. And as of the second month, a little bit of typing was okay. But it basically took 3 months before I could start typing again. And even then, it's full recovery, so to speak, is about 6 months where you can start pretty much getting active again. But normally it takes a year for your shoulder to recover from the surgery. And that's what I noticed. So that issue, that problem with my shoulder, basically slowed everything down once again. And then there was a lot of other stuff going on in my just personally that I won't discuss publicly, but that also took up a lot of time. But in the end, the book was finished, and I was very happy with that, because it'd been the way it works for me is that I tend to obsess about the topic that I'm writing about, so it's constantly on my mind. And after a while, you get tired of having all that stuff in your head, so you want to be done with it. And I was at that stage for a long time already, actually. So I finished the book. Then it is just letting it rest for a little while, going back and tinkering with it, just dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure everything's all right. Then I sent it out to the person who I hired to copy edit it and proofread it, and that was a horrible experience, because that person basically just terrorized my manuscript and beat it into something that it wasn't meant to be. So I pretty much had to start from, I wouldn't say forget everything and take out everything that the copy editor did, but it didn't work at all. That person had a very different idea about how to proofread and copy edit than what I was used to, or that I would consider standard, industry standard. So that was a waste of money, and for the most part. And so I started from scratch and made sure the copy editing and proofreading was done again. Again, this adds an additional month and a half to the process, maybe even a little bit longer. And then we finally get to the point where I'm doing the pictures. Pictures were pretty good, but then there was technical stuff going on with the pictures. They were in the wrong file type, so I had to convert them. That was difficult. I spent a week doing some stuff there, so really technical stuff. You guys who work with Photoshop and those kind of programs, you know what I'm talking about. It can get quite difficult, especially because I had hundreds of pictures to sift through, and I had to convert them all first before I could decide which ones I wanted to use, because I needed to know what they looked like in the final version before I could make decisions. So I ended up with about 130 or 140 pictures in the book. And then finally, the book was ready for formatting, which means that I have a Word document, I have a bunch of pictures, and then I hire somebody to turn that into an ebook and into a file that can be used to make the paperback. Loads of problems there as well. Took forever. Communication was extremely difficult and so on. But eventually that also got sorted out. And then I said, you know what? I'm ready to launch the book. I prepared this marketing campaign, do a bunch of stuff. I hit publish. And then it was just one problem after the other with Kindle Direct Publishing, that I couldn't order proof copies the way that it was supposed to work. They locked the book. I couldn't make any changes. So loads and loads of stuff that my patrons heard me talk about, and I shared my frustration with them a little bit. This is pretty much the worst launch that I've ever had of all the books I've written. But again, thanks to my patrons, The book did better than expected the last few days, because I hit number 1 in the 3 main Amazon categories that I wanted to get in, which is boxing and martial arts, both for books and ebooks. When it comes to boxing, and I'm extremely happy and grateful for all of you who already bought the book. I hope you enjoy it a lot. But if you haven't, what's it all about? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. So first off, who is the book for? I'm aiming it at 2 categories of people, very specifically. First, if you're already boxing as a sport, to be in shape, even if you are an amateur boxer, it doesn't matter, but you're already training in boxing, but you also want to apply it for self-defense, and you understand that self-defense and combat sports are not exactly the same thing, then the book is for you. It's trying to help you see the differences between the ring and the street, as the subtitle says. The second category of people that I'm aiming the book at is beginners. People who have no experience or extremely little, but they only have a boxing gym nearby, or they only have access to somebody who wants to teach them boxing or can teach them boxing. So that's the only choice they have. Well, then the book is meant to be a guide for those beginners to help them figure out what transfers from the ring to the street and what doesn't. Which immediately brings me to the topic, so what it's about. It's about self-defense purely. It's not about sports. So I constantly go on about what are the differences, how can you do something in the ring, but that doesn't work exactly the same way in the street when you have to defend yourself, and which things do transfer. So that's the whole point of the book, is figuring out kind of like which traps to avoid and what are the strengths of boxing that you can actually apply quite well. What is it not about? It's not old school boxing from like the 1800s. That's not it. It's not the boxing from over a century ago when it was bare knuckle fighting. That is not what it's about, because it's still too much sports oriented. It's still too much dueling and a competitive contest. So it's about self-defense. So then I wanted to be very clear about that, because I'm sure people will misinterpret it. I try to be as clear as I can. In the title, it says it clearly, boxing for self-defense. And in the subtitle, it says that you take it from the ring to the street. So I would assume that it would be clear, but if there's one thing that I've learned in the past 20 years of being online and talking about self-defense and martial arts and combat sports, is that no matter how clear you try to be, it still often doesn't get through the message. So that was it. Now, what's it all about? Well, it's all about adapting the sports boxing to the context of self-defense, which is a radically different context. And then in the first chapter, I talk about just basically, it's always called nuts and bolts. I learned this from Lauren Christensen. It's the kind of chapter where you put stuff in there that you can't put anywhere else. But the problem is that it's not long enough, each topic, to make it a specific chapter. It's only a bunch of concepts and ideas and important information that the reader needs to know. But it's just, if you put it in a separate chapter, you will have like sometimes 2 or 3 page chapters, and that doesn't work. So the way I see it is that, okay, before you get started with the training, before we can even talk about training, here's the stuff you need to know and understand. Once you understand that, then we can move on, and then you have everything squared away to start your training. So what is in there? Well, there's stuff like, okay, open hand or closed fist, which is better, quote unquote. How do you have to view that topic, which is highly debated. There are a bunch of dogmas about it that I disagree with. And I talk in detail about why I see the things the way that I do, and which factors are involved in making the decision. If we're talking about self-defense and boxing, well, you're going to be empty-handed in the sense that you won't be wearing 12 or 14 ounce boxing gloves in self-defense. So how do you deal with that? Well, there's one aspect. That's one aspect that I'm covering. Different angles, generating power, distance. All these things are fundamental concepts that you have to understand before you can apply the techniques from boxing for self-defense. And that brings us right away to the second chapter, which is basic stance and footwork. The boxing stance that you see in the ring is generally not the one you start with when it comes to the street. So you start differently, not always, but very often. Okay, well, what kind of stances are there? What are the strengths and weaknesses? How do you use them, and what point in the conflict do you switch to a more traditional boxing stance, and so on? Same thing for the footwork. What kind of footwork do we use? Is it Muhammad Ali type footwork? Is it Vasily Lomachenko footwork? Well, what is it about? Well, talk about that. And then the following chapters are just about the basics. So there's basic offense, jab, cross, hooks, uppercuts, those kind of techniques. And then basic defense, parries, blocking, head movement. But always focusing on fundamental technique and basic technique, meaning the bread and butter techniques, the techniques that have a very high likelihood of succeeding. There are no secret techniques in the book. I don't believe in secret techniques to begin with, but there's nothing fancy in there. There's just sound fundamentals that you can rely upon. The reason why I picked that is because it needs to work when you get sucker punched and you're half out of it and you just have to go by instinct and training. You will not always be in a position where you can have the time to prepare, get ready, line everything up, and then throw the perfect, right cross or a lead hook or whatever. Not saying it doesn't happen, but in many cases in self-defense, that just doesn't happen. You're in a disadvantageous position and you have to fight from there. Somebody surprises you and you have to fight from however you're standing with whatever technique you can muster at the moment. So it's a very different mindset from you have months to prepare, you can warm up, you go in the ring, there's an announcer, the bell rings, and then you have time to get started. And there's always the referee who can intervene if something goes wrong. Totally different context. So what I like to have is basics that you can rely upon. Just sound technique that you know that even if you're tired, even if you get hit, if you can perform the technique correctly, it can still get the job done. And then we get to the last 3 chapters. There's a chapter on clinching, because clinching is very different in the ring when compared to the street. One of the main things of boxing, one of the drawbacks actually when it comes to self-defense, is that in modern boxing, the boxing we see nowadays, not the old school, but the boxing from nowadays, the clinch is very different, and it is less something that you see when it comes to violent attackers in the street and so on. That's not the kind of clinching they do. There's a lot more grappling, wrestling type, not exactly, but it's the same kind of clinching or similar clinching to what you see in those arts. That is more likely to happen. And obviously, there's a danger of going to the ground. So as a boxer, ground fighting is not your strong suit. Very simply speaking, you don't practice that at all when you practice Western boxing. That's not something you do. So you shouldn't expect to just automatically be able to handle somebody trying to take you down. So I show some really basic techniques from the clinch, how to get out of some basic positions and basic holds that people take you in. And this is just common stuff. Just like typical bear hug and somebody doing a double necktie, and just a really basic stuff that when you watch street fights, I'm not talking about trained fighters. I'm not talking about guys who decide to get together and just bash each other's brain in for whatever ego reason or so on. It's not a duel. It's what you see when people who ambush each other, when criminals try to beat somebody up or rob them and so on. It's that kind of stuff. So that's the chapter about clinching. And then we get to one to goals and tactics. And that is basically the fundamentals that I explain for what will be explained in so much more detail in volume 3. And that is, how is the ring different from the street when it comes to the purpose of each technique and the tactics that you use. For instance, orientation is a big part of it. You will not always have your opponent standing right in front of you. Quite on the contrary, when you have to defend yourself, it makes sense for the attacker to, for instance, hit you from behind, hit you over the back of the head. Obviously, that means that you can do that too. So how does orientation play a role? Well, that's one of the things that I cover there. And then the book ends with basic mistakes, is some of the things that I see boxers do routinely when it comes to defending themselves. It's just some stuff that they get wrong, or that they overemphasize, and it doesn't seem relevant when they overemphasize that in training in the ring. But once they're in self-defense, well, then that kind of stuff suddenly backfires because of the different context. And that's pretty much it. That's a lot of stuff in there. Again, the first book that is out now, that is just the basics you need to get started. If you can, train that stuff well, you're well on your way to making boxing an effective self-defense system already. Now, I'm not saying that the stuff that you do in the ring as a combat sport can't work. That's never what I said. Quite on the contrary. And just to give the example that my followers on Facebook and Instagram already saw, after more than, I'm almost 35 years in Chinese and other Asian martial arts right now. So I've spent most of my time doing that kind of stuff. Despite all that, despite the fact that I teach that professionally, when my boy wanted to learn martial arts, the first thing I taught him was Western boxing. The very first thing, I posted a picture of him when he was very small with his boxing gloves on, throwing hook punches. So that's how highly I regard boxing as a system of self-defense. At the very least, the potential that is there. And then, as always, I distinguish between combat sports and self-defense because they are different contexts. Just as I distinguish, for instance, between combat sports and military hand-to-hand combatives. Totally different environment. And just as I distinguish between military hand-to-hand combatives and law enforcement combatives or arresting techniques. Again, totally different context. We need different techniques. There is overlap, but there are differences. Then we get back to Randy's Law, which is something I've talked about at length. And the same applies here. So for those of you who have been following my work for a while now, you know that Randy's Law is one of the most important things that I ever discovered when it comes to training and teaching and so on. Well, you can see this book is another manifestation of that. And that's basically what are the differences between boxing as a sport and as a self-defense system. Well, that's what all this year's about. So if you want to get a book, again, go to wimdemeere.com/boxing. So as of right now, ebook is ready. It's good to go. You can get that one. And the paperback is on its way. If you can't get it right away, give it a few days, and it's making its way to all the Amazon stores worldwide. Now, I hit the publish button for iTunes and Kobo and all the other online retailers as well. That's going to take a little bit longer because they're a little bit slower. That's just how it is. So that said, if you guys could do me a huge favor, make some noise about the book, share this podcast or a link to the book online. But most of all, if you can, please leave a review after you buy it. Just an honest review. Just give your opinion, good, bad, neutral, whatever. What did you like? What did you not like? And I said that before, but I actually read reviews. I rarely, if ever, comment, but I read reviews, and there's very often valuable feedback that somebody says like, hey, I like this, but I didn't like that because of this and this reason. And then sometimes it gives me inspiration to do something different next time, or it gives me inspiration to write maybe a separate chapter in a following book. So that's why reviews are valuable to me personally, but obviously it helps for the book to do well if it gets reviews. So again, I'd appreciate that. Now, all that said, what's coming next? Well, I have choices to make. I have dozens of books planned. I think I won't have enough time to write them all. But the next book that I'm going to write is tentatively called Essential Self-Defense Tips for Men to Avoid Violence. Now, this is again related to one of my blog posts, and that is actually the number one blog post that I've had for years, which is Essential Self-Defense Tips for Men. And the title says it all. It's just practical tips for men on how can you avoid violence. And I'm going to do one tip per chapter, and then in a very detailed manner give you practical tools of how you can use that tip in your everyday life to stay safe. Now, that book is not going to be about techniques at all. So there won't be pictures. It's not a picture-driven book. Unlike the boxing books, these are very much picture-driven. There's lots of pictures in there so you can see the techniques and see what I'm talking about. Whereas this self-defense tips book is going to be text-driven, and it's going to be, all right, read this, think about it, apply the information, do the drills, do the exercises, and then it's going to help keep you safe. It's not about knocking people out. It's about you figuring out a way how and using that information to avoid having to throw that punch in the first place. That's the whole deal. Now, right now, the book's about halfway done. I think I'm a little bit further already, and I hope to finish that one as soon as possible. That should be, for me, a less grueling experience than writing the boxing book, because, as I explained, that was really torture. Let's put it that way. But so the self-defense tips book, that's something that I'm looking forward to, because if you do the picture-driven books and the technique-driven books like the boxing book, that's a very different way of writing than writing something like the self-defense tips book, which is text-oriented and conceptual and so on. So it's a different way of writing, which if you write, you know what I'm talking about. If you're only a reader, that is something that is hard for me to explain. And it's just the way that my writing brain works, is that certain things, it's kind of like trying to get into a different way of concentrating and focusing on how you put the information on the paper. Now, the second reason why I want to do this one first is that, well, it's halfway done and I would really like a break from the boxing stuff. It's been on my mind for years now, and I just want to refresh a little bit, focus on something else, and then come back to Boxing for Self-Defense Volume 2, which will be all the illegal blows and the foul techniques from boxing and much more, so I can focus on that again with a fresh mind. And as always happens, I have new ideas if I stop thinking about the boxing and focus on something else. Well, again, the way my mind works is then there's always these little ideas that pop up, and it's like little balloons that start flying upwards, and I'm like, ooh, this is a good idea, and I'll just add that to the list. And then when I get to the writing, then or I already have a bunch of stuff that I've basically brainstormed already, and that I can decide what to do with in that volume. So that would be the book that's going to come after the self-defense books, and that would be Boxing for Self-Defense number 2. So again, illegal blows, rabbit punches, elbows, headbutting, all that kind of stuff, and obviously also training drills and other concepts and ideas, so you can practice these techniques. Because obviously you can't really spar the same way than you do in boxing if you're including all the illegal blows, because that would basically mean hospital time every time somebody spars like that. If you do it with intent, obviously, and a lot of power. So again, another technique-driven book, lots of pictures, and that's what I have planned so far. Obviously, I have a bunch more planned, but I am not going to talk about that today because it's too soon and it's likely to change by the time that I get to it. That's pretty much it, guys. That's it for the podcast episode. Everybody again who already bought the book, I want to thank you, because that makes a huge difference for me personally. And I hope if you haven't bought it and you've listened to the podcast, that you found it interesting enough to maybe check out the book and get it for yourself. And again, leave a reviews, drop me a note on Facebook or something, and let me know what you liked, what you would have preferred to see different, and so on. And again, I'm always interested in feedback, so that would be great. Now I'm gonna wrap things up. For the links that I mentioned, you can go to wimsblog.com/43, so number 43, and that takes you to the show notes for this episode. And again, I'll put all the links there. Enjoy that, and I will talk to you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.